Good morning, and welcome to the 2022 All Industry Day. My name is Alexis Garrett, and I'm the Los Angeles CBCU Society President. I'm honored to be here with all of you and to help kick off this event. If this is your first time, welcome. If you have participated in the past, either virtually or in person, welcome back. On behalf of all of the chapters and our I-Day committee, I'm here to say we're excited for what we have in store for you. So let's do a quick overview of what to expect today. So this morning, we're going to start off with Jane Utter at Satine Corporation on the topic on ESG and enterprise risk management. Then we will have John Sauerland at Progressive, who will talk about current issues in insurance. Then you'll have an option between employee retention, virtual workforce with Darren Bloomfield and Jeff Gibson, or parametric insurance with Scott Carpenteri. Then we will also be recognizing all the new designees in the region, as well as presenting awards, and then ending with a memorial for Ken Kanehiro and Earl Hisatomi. Once we get back from break, please come back as we will be also hearing from the CBCU Society President, Chris Hampshire, and he will be talking about current and future events. As well, we will also be hearing from Precious Walton on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll end the day again with two options. Of either you can attend the property inflation topic with Justin Woodward and Greg Pine, or nuclear verdicts, social inflation with Julia Fuller and Bob Tyson. Throughout the day, we will anticipate having breaks, so we'll allow you guys to have time to get water or to stretch. But do come back to attend as many sessions as you can. But if you can't, do note that we will also have a recording at the end of the day. And with that, I will transition over to Ward and Jasmine.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for being here. I'm Ward Sheng with the University of Southern California Marshall Business School, as well as with Aon. I lead the Strategic Solutions and Innovation practice. I'm co-hosting this session today with my colleague Jasmine Klein. This session is entitled ESG and Enterprise Risk Management, and it features Jana Utter. Jana has been an absolute pioneer in the area of bringing structured enterprise risk management together with this new area of ESG. This has been Jana's real year. She's won a number of awards across the industry and outside the industry as she's been pioneering this particular opportunity. She was also the RIMS Risk Management Honor Roll awardee this year as well. She has published in this space, she has given other talks in this space, but the most important thing for all of you to recognize is that ESG is a critical issue. It's out there, it's impacting us on the insurance side as well as the risk management side, and Jana's done yeoman's duty helping people to understand what it is, how it works, and how you bring it together with enterprise risk management. The way we're going to set up this panel is that Jana will be using a presentation that she's posted and she'll bring up. And then Jasmine and I will be asking questions along the way. We will finish this presentation just a little after 9:05, and Jasmine will be closing the session. But most important, I wanted all of you to meet Jana. She's done something really, really special. And so Jana, let's start with, bring up the presentation and start a little bit with you and what you've been doing and where you came from, and then let's launch into the innovations that you brought to the table.
Sounds good, Ward. So just a quick sound check. Everyone can hear me, a thumbs up or, okay, I see Ward nodding. I just wanted to make sure. So I'm really happy to be here talking about two of my favorite subjects that are quickly merging into one subject, and that's ERM and ESG. And to me, the two absolutely go together. And so that's what I mean by merging into one. A little bit about my background. Maybe you have a bio, but I've done enterprise risk management for about 20 years. And one thing I really enjoy about ERM is it never changes. It's continually evolving and have gone through different phases of ERM where it was first, hey, let's just get it going. And it's kind of like the checklist approach, which I don't advocate. And then it's moving more towards inclusiveness of cybersecurity was something that came up probably about 10 to 12 years ago. And then it became that intersection with governance, risk, and compliance. And so I spent a lot of time in the GRC space as well. And then a little bit about how ERM and ESG came to be something that I think of as really one discipline at this point. Whenever I came to Centene about 7 years ago, and just to make sure everyone's aware, Centene is actually a Fortune 26 company, and we are a managed healthcare organization, which means that we operate the Medicaid program in about 30 different states. We also have the marketplace product, which is somewhat remember as Obamacare. And then we also offer Medicare. And so that's the space that I work within. We also, some of you being out there on the West Coast may be familiar with Health Net Federal Services. And Health Net serves the active military and their families pretty much everywhere west of the Mississippi. So those are kind of our core operations. So whenever I came to Centene, one of the first things that I started, and I'm going to go ahead and jump to the next slide here if I can. Let's see. Having a little bit of trouble advancing it for some reason, but let's see. Okay, there we go. Whenever I first came to Centene, I formally developed an emerging risk report. And so in that emerging risk report, as a matter of fact, from the very first one that we published in probably early 2016, the topic that was starting to come up was elements of ESG. And so it didn't start out as ESG on the emerging risk report. It was increasing demand for disclosure about executive compensation would be the topic. And so that led to the say on pay that most of you are probably familiar with, that's required to be put in the annual proxy statement, the ratio of the CEO's salary to, I think it's the average salary of the employees in the company. So that was one emerging risk that became a reality. And then there was at that particular time for insurers increasing demand for climate related data. And so since this is a group of property and casualty underwriters, I believe, or property and casualty insurance managers, most everyone's probably familiar with the NAIC, and there's the Climate Risk Disclosure Survey. That is something that we do on an annual basis as an NAIC filing. And so even as early as the time I was starting at Centene, there was more demand for increasing the rigor around climate-related reporting. So I think what is key here is I started to see in the first couple of years that I was at Centene, this kind of growing pattern of ESG related topics that were hitting our emerging risk report and then actually becoming reality. They'd be emerging and then they became a reality. And so it was probably around 2018 that there began to be more investor focus on ESG. So that kind of covers the first bullet here. Why is ESG at the forefront of investors and regulators? So I want to talk about that a little bit. And then from there, we'll go to this more intersection around ERM supporting ESG reporting. We'll talk a little bit about the climate risk assessment and then close with the growing role of the ESG controller. And so I want to jump on. It's not letting me use my cursor, so I'm going to have to use my scroll bar to get to the next slide. So hopefully I won't jump ahead. But why are investors interested in ESG? I think the quote on this particular slide sums it up pretty well. And I'm not going to read the quote. The quote basically informs that aside from financial performance and the value that a company provides its stakeholders through its financial performance and long-term value from a financial perspective, there's also the importance around non-financial performance factors. And so that's what the nomenclature ESG evolved to encompass. It's those initially mostly non-financial performance factors, but if you're in the risk world, we know at the end of the day, anything non-financial can have a financial impact. So I don't know that there's really any such thing as a non-financial performance factor. But nonetheless, a lot of the ESG metrics employ turnover, diversity, equity, and inclusion metrics, greenhouse gas emissions, even say on pay. Those are non-financial metrics. We're not seeing those metrics, at least today, reported in the SEC filings like the 10K, except for the say on pay that I mentioned earlier. And so there's been studies done at the university level where companies that were delivering long-term financial value were being seen to also be delivering long-term value to society. And so that's where the ESG performance factors started to be viewed by the investor community as equally important to the financial performance factors. So that's why we're starting to see more of this demand for transparency on greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas emissions. And why is that important? It's because there's the potential for there to be carbon taxes in the future. And so companies that are heavy emitters of greenhouse gases could all of a sudden have carbon taxes that are impacting their financial performance. In addition, with the net zero goals that the US has set for themselves, there's also the risk that they would not be a company that would be in favor with consumers or banks for financing, or even insurance companies for insuring, if the risk around them and their greenhouse gas emissions are too high. So we start to see where these ESG performance factors under the E pillar, social pillar for S, and the governance pillar can begin to impact long-term financial value. So that's the basic premise around why the investor community and also regulators are most interested now, are interested equally to financial performance as they are to ESG performance factors.
Jana, on the issue of the regulator, I know you're going to be talking about this a little bit more, but are the regulators actually starting to put teeth into their regulation where there might be penalties?
As far as penalties, I guess whenever I think about the penalties today, with the NAIC filings, for instance, it depends on the state as to how they adopt those model laws as to whether or not there's any financial penalty. So the penalties today would be more, I'd say, administrative, in that you didn't submit your climate risk disclosure survey on time and you could be fined $100 a day by a particular state, because you hadn't submitted in time. So that would be where the only type of financial penalties that I'm aware of today that the regulators would be concerned about. And so I'd treat it just like any NAIC filing. With that said, there are a couple of states, actually one in particular, that has more stringent climate reporting disclosure rules than most states, and that is the state of New York. The New York Department of Financial Services, when they adopted the climate risk disclosure survey, actually they adopted it a long time ago, but just recently they added to the climate risk disclosure requirements in New York and require additional filings. So, but that's about it today. Now, once the SEC adopts the climate related financial disclosures, I actually am not that familiar with what the SEC penalties can be for not reporting, but that would be something to be aware of. Now, Ward, I want to also just cover, I think you were getting at too, what if your metrics aren't where they're supposed to be? What if your greenhouse gas emissions are too high? How does someone determine if they're too high? I've not seen anything yet that says, everyone should have greenhouse gas emissions no less than or no more than X amount. Right now, the potential ramification would be in higher greenhouse gas emissions may mean higher risk, which could mean higher insurance premiums or higher bank financing charges because there's a perception of more risk.
Yeah, I don't think the standards have been set yet, nor have the standards been standardized. The issue is going to be what happens when that happens,
Right.
And how does that get enforced? And as we know, in our environments, price dictates that price could be associated with insurance or banking or whatever could be a major issue, but it's certainly translating now into the insurance space. We now have carriers that are declining to underwrite high carbon footprint clients.
Mm-hmm.
They're backing off on capacity. They're changing their pricing mechanisms. They're putting in sub limits. They're putting in sub conditions, and they are asking for the ESG materials and the audit statements as a way to demonstrate, as in terms of the submission, what's going on. So it's coming, and it's coming pretty quickly.
Yes, it is. At this point, it is coming pretty quickly. I just quickly want to cover these concepts because I think they are important. Basically, the double materiality is what I was talking about non-financial performance and financial performance. It's sort of a double materiality concept in financial reporting metrics. And then there's value-based investing and values-based investing. And I also think this is a key distinction. And the reason why this has become important to me is because we get investor inquiries all the time. And a lot of the investor inquiries are more on, now keep in mind we're a health insurer, are more around what types of procedures we insure, or what types of medical procedures like stem cell research and genetic type research, for instance. What are we offering those services or are we not? So when you think about faith-based investing for, say, religious pension funds, values-based investing is their primary driver. They're trying to invest for returns for pensions, but first and foremost, they only want to invest in companies that meet their values. So that's one type of investing that covers ESG related topics. And then the other, like BlackRock and State Street and the big investment asset managers, they're more focused on that value-based investing. So they are concerned about ESG metrics for the purpose of determining long-term financial performance. So just something to keep in mind if you work with this every day, because you'll get questions on both sides of the fence and it can be a bit confusing until you really understand, oh, they're values-based focused versus value focused. So a little bit about ESG and value creation. How does this really tie with strategy, and how does it tie with ERM? How can the ERM framework or ERM team actually support ESG? And so whenever I like to think about it like this, and again, this has evolved over working with this, so I just kind of figured this all out along the way. But if enterprise risk management, you think of one of the goals of enterprise risk management is to identify and manage risk appropriately so that the company can meet its long-term strategic initiatives and its financial performance goals. And so that's what ERM is trying to do, protect financial value so that the company can succeed. And so we were talking earlier about how ESG is a type of value creation from non-financial performance factors. So it only makes sense that ERM would also be helping the company to understand the risk around its non-financial performance factors and be helping to identify and helping the company to manage those non-financial performance factor gaps and risk in order to achieve long-term financial performance goals. And so I really see it as like three legs of the stool. We used to always think, and this is even going to the COSO latest edition of the ERM framework, for whoever's for whoever is familiar with COSO, in 2017, COSO updated the enterprise risk management framework and specifically called it integrating ERM with strategy and financial performance. And so that intersection between ERM and strategy is quite clear. And then ESG is also working to try to align those ESG related topics with strategy. So you have the little example over on the right is the ESG strategy and governance. The ESG, I mean, diversity and equity and inclusion needs to be part of the company's culture, part of just embedded in the company's strategy. And same with corporate governance. That is part of the foundational aspect of the success of a company for it to be able to achieve its strategic initiatives is good governance practices. So you can start to see where ESG is tied to strategy and supports strategy. And then enterprise risk management is working to make sure that the risk or gaps around achievement of strategy, in this case, focusing on ESG, gaps in ESG are addressed and appropriately identified and managed. And many of the topics you see over on the strategic objectives, you could start to think, well, okay, what are our risks? You see data security and privacy there. You see employee pension security, for example. Those are all risks that could easily be on the company's enterprise risk management, enterprise risk register. And so these, to me, ESG is seamless with ERM and strategy. Let's see. So applying risk management, I talked a little bit about this already, the COSO framework. And what I really like about COSO is that it is a reliable guidance for enterprise risk management and also I'd say the internal audit world. And so you can see that COSO came out with that integrating with strategy and performance for ERM. There's the integrated control framework. And then there's also the applying the ERM guidance to environmental, social, and governance specifically. And so the reason the internal control framework is important is, I know we've alluded to the fact, and many of you probably already know, the SEC has a proposed rule for climate disclosures that will likely go into effect later this year. That's what their goal is anyway. Well, anything that's in SEC reporting, hence 10K, has to have process and controls around it. So think SOX-like controls for environmental and social governance metrics and disclosures. So DEI related metrics that we are all probably publishing, at least on our websites, greenhouse gas emissions, energy usage, any metrics and disclosures that a company is including in its sustainability or ESG reporting could potentially be subject to required internal controls and SOX-like processes. Now, today that's optional. No one is saying, oh, well, you have to have your external auditor sign off on your ESG disclosures. But as the SEC starts to adopt various SEC disclosures, such as the climate rule for greenhouse gases and energy usage, and that information is going to be in your 10K, you're going to have the process controls around those disclosures. And it's best practice today that you have that as well. And so COSO, once again, is coming out, it's supposed to be any day now. It said the fall, so I suppose they have to like, December 20th or 21st or so to be technically fall. But COSO is supposed to be coming out with the internal control integrated framework applied to ESG, like we saw them do with ERM. And so I just pulled out, you can use this for reference later. Let's see, it looks like I've got on my end anyway. There we go, get rid of a little pop-up there. But this is just where, if you look at the applying enterprise risk management to ESG, and if you're familiar with what people call like the little DNA scrolls there for the ERM guidance that was in the new COSO update, the very same 5 key elements that are in the COSO guidance for ERM can be applied and should be applied to ESG. And so, for ESG, governance and accountability, also for ESG, just like risk, strategy, and objective setting, performance-related aspects where we identify, assess, and prioritize risk and implement risk responses, regular reporting and monitoring for ESG-related risk, and then communication and reporting. This is exactly the same as ERM. So that's what the point is here. More about COSO ERM checklist. You can look at that later. I definitely wanted to cover prioritizing ESG concerns. And so this is something else that we did in early 2020, actually. So we started in late 2019. For anyone that has started to try to tackle ESG, if you start looking for guidance on, okay, what ESG topics should I consider in my ESG reporting? There's no consistent framework for ESG at this time. So you can start looking at any of the big fours, like PwC, Deloitte, et cetera. They're going to have a different list of topics. S&P has a list of topics. The NASDAQ has a list of topics. There's probably tens upon tens of different sources for ESG topics. So then if you start looking at all of those different sources, you'll end up with well over hundreds of potential ESG topics. It's like, well, how can I ever track and report on 100 plus ESG topics? So just like enterprise risk management, we do what we call materiality assessment for ESG. Now, this is materiality not so much in the financial sense, and it's more in what topics in the realm of ESG is not impact and likelihood. We're looking at most important to our stakeholders and also most important to the company in achieving its strategy, mission, and purpose, and financial performance as well. So when you think about your stakeholders, who are your stakeholders? Most companies, especially if you're publicly traded, it's going to be your investors, it could be your regulators, it's going to be your customers and your employees. That's usually, at least at a minimum, who the stakeholders are. And so what topics are they most concerned about? So that's where, depending on what type of entity you are, you might be thinking back to that value and values-based investing. Are the people that are investing in my company more value-based, financial focused, or do they really care about the products my company is manufacturing, whether or not those are recyclable and good for society? So you have to think about what topics might be important to your whole set of stakeholders. And then also, you want it to be important to the business, thinking about strategy. You don't want to have this one-off set of ESG topics that you're focusing on that's different from what the company's strategy is. So it's very important to think about the key topics important to the company's strategy and purpose, as well as to stakeholders, and balance that out. See if I can curse to the next slide here. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit and focus on the climate risk assessment. But before I do that, Ward or Jasmine, any questions before I move on to talk specifically about the climate risk assessment?
No, I think you've covered that really, really well. I also wanted to point out that while COSO is one major ERM framework, there is also the ISO 31000 framework. There are others that are emerging in different parts of the world. So depending on who you are, what you're doing, there may be subtle differences. Now, the one thing that I did notice in the chart before was that you were looking for the individual topics in the specific areas. One of the things that we're noticing academically, at least, is that these topics are not always independent. They do have connections to each other. So one of the things that's useful when you start inventorying is not only get to the experts within your own organization and perhaps outside to identify what these topics are, but put some parameters around them, like, can you really define them? Can you measure them economically? Are they tied to something else so that you might have a chain that works together that might actually cross the E, S, and G space? Who owns these topics inside your own organization, and how do they view it from both an economic and operational point of view? So that assessment is really critical, but it's also probably the hardest thing to do because you're trying to determine the landscape of your analysis. And I don't know about anybody else on this call, but when I get into a room with a whole bunch of executives, I find that the number of the executives may have entirely independent views. And so it becomes a question of how do you blend this? How do you prioritize? How do you get sort of voice of the customer side of this in place? How did you do that, though?
Yes,
Jana?
I'm glad you asked that, Ward, because I was going to comment on it now anyway. We followed the same process that we would for an ERM assessment. And so when we did our materiality assessment, we met with all of the executives that we normally meet with when we meet with them about enterprise risk. And so being the ERM team, we're used to these challenges and priorities, different conflicting priorities of executives, and trying to work with them to mesh that out on, well, what's our top risk? So we followed those same sort of assessment techniques that we would have for ERM on the materiality assessment, on trying to determine which are our most important topics. And we started out with, I'd say, 25 to 30 topics and narrowed it down to 16. And so much the same as an ERM process, by the time we'd met with all of the executives, there were some topics that resonated with everybody, some topics that resonated with several, but not everyone. And then some topics that maybe only one or two people felt like, felt strongly about. And so we were able to narrow it down to 16 topics. And to Ward's point, and something I did want to mention too about how we did our ESG, we call it our ESG strategic framework, is what the result was of our materiality assessment. Just like ERM, it's not prescriptive. And so being a health insurance company, during our discussions with executives, we kept coming back to health-related topics because that's aligned with our mission and purpose, which is transforming the health of the community, one person at a time, and better health outcomes at lower prices. And so we decided to actually carve out a set of topics and develop what we call an H pillar in our ESG strategic framework. So we call it ESHG. And in the H pillar is what I would say we pulled out some topics that might have been in the social pillar, but are very unique to a healthcare company. And that's healthcare access, healthcare affordability, healthcare quality, research and development, and health policy. And so that's worked very well for us. As a matter of fact, earlier this year, I saw an article come out. It was either Forbes, I think it was Forbes magazine, said, is H the missing letter in ESG? It's like, H, we already have that, And so they were talking about it more from health of of employees and health of customers, making sure you have products that are promoting the health of your customers as well. But anyway, we were pretty happy to see that there were others that were resonating with the H that we'd added to our ESHG strategy. So I do want to make sure, I know we got maybe about 10 minutes left here. So I want to make sure I cover the climate risk assessment, because climate risk is what's really getting the attention right now because of the SEC proposed rule. And so Larry Fink, that's a little picture of Larry there. He's the one that's the chairman of BlackRock Asset Managers, and has his annual letter to CEOs. And I guess it was this year, he has this climate risk is investment risk. So we talked about that earlier, about why climate related risk can turn into investment risk. And so a little nod there to Larry Fink. And I wanted to talk about the SEC climate disclosures. The key here, I'm not going to read through all of these because it's too much detail for this particular conversation. But the reason why there is text highlighted in red is because each one of those highlights represents something related to risk. And so you can see that in the SEC climate related disclosures, there's a lot of overlay with risk. And so the point here is, I keep proving it over and over, ERM and ESG should be intertwined. If the same person isn't responsible for ESG that's responsible for ERM, then the ERM person or the ESG person at the company, they should be working in tandem with each other and include their strategy team as the third partner there. So that's, to me, critical for a successful ESG program. And the reason why this is getting so much attention from the SEC proposed rule is because climate-related impacts, whether they are positive or negative, so opportunity or a detriment to the financial statements, greater than 1% of any line item in the financial statement. So this isn't overall, this is any line item would have to be reported in your 10K filing, along with details as to what the impact was and how it was determined and so forth. And that's asking quite a lot, really. So the little icons on the side here are thinking about, what if there's hurricane issues that cause detriment to facilities in your area and within your company's purview? Fire-related issues related to droughts or wildfires, rising temperatures. And actually, the one there in the bottom right that I want to highlight is an opportunity: decreased greenhouse gas emissions. So you think right now, hey, our company, we're doing great. We set a target 3 years ago to be net zero by 2030. And there were no teeth in that target a few years ago. But now, if this SEC ruling is adopted, you would have to be detailing out in your SEC statements whether or not you're on track to meet the climate targets you set, saying you'd be net zero by 2030. So this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. Hey, 3 years ago, it sounded really good for us to be net zero by 2030, but we didn't really know how we're going to get there. Well, you better figure out how you're going to get there, because you're going to have to be reporting whether you're on track or not on track, and why. That's going to have to be in your financial statements. If you're doing great, it could be that opportunity side. Hey, we not only have on track for 2030, but now we're going to be net zero by 2027. So that's kind of the opportunity side of it. And the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is what this slide represents. And so if you are an insurance company and having to do that NAIC Climate Risk Disclosure Survey, beginning this year, actually it started last year, it's more official this year, but beginning this year, there's an expectation that you are using, it's not required, it's kind of loosely written, but you're supposed to be modeling your climate risk disclosure survey submission based on guidance from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So this basically means that you need to do a TCFD report. And TCFD requires that there's reporting on the governance structure overseeing climate-related risk. There's a description of the strategy around managing climate-related risk. There's identification of risk around climate-related disclosure or climate-related impacts, and then metrics and targets. And so this is what I was talking about earlier that really mirrors COSO's ERM framework of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. Reporting isn't on this particular diagram, but the TCFD by nature is a reporting process. So a lot of parallels there between ERM aspects, and in this case, we're only talking about climate risk in the realm of ESG. Oops, go back one. Let's see if I can get it to scroll one more time. There we go. So the climate risk considerations, I'm going to just use this slide as a backdrop. We, again, like we did with the materiality assessment, applied the processes that we used actually for our own risk and solvency assessment, or the ORSA, if you're familiar with that, to how we did our climate risk assessment. So for our ORSA modeling, we have what we call critical risk workshops. And those critical risk workshops is where we meet with subject matter experts across the company on a topic, let's just say like a data loss event. And so data loss event, well, when we are talking about it from an ERM perspective, we might talk to the information security department about, they probably own that risk, and we're asking them to make updates for the data privacy and security related risk or data loss event. So it's a little more one-dimensional in a standard qualitative ERM process reporting. But for ORSA, we would gather subject matter experts across the company to talk about data privacy and data loss events. So it might be people from IT, from compliance, from data governance, from marketing even, because of marketing materials that might have privacy related information in some of those materials that we mail out. And so we would talk to several subject matter experts across the company to get their thoughts around inputs for the modeling of that particular risk. For climate risk, we did something very similar to that. We had climate workshops, and we brought in people across the company to brainstorm on what could be our climate related risk and what might the impact of those climate risk be to the company, and what might the opportunities be to the company around climate related risk. And so TCFD, that Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, much like COSO, has a set of guidelines for how to do a climate, or what needs to be included in a climate risk assessment. So we followed TCFD, much like we would have followed COSO processes or ISO 31000 processes for ERM, and applied that to determine our climate risk through a climate risk assessment. So again, if you have a different team at your company that's trying to do the climate risk assessment and they're not aligned with the ERM approach, you could see where you could really have an apples and oranges type situation, that this climate risk one-off assessment might say something's really a big risk, but if ERM's not capturing it or it's not harmonized with ERM reporting, then how big a risk is it really? So that's, again, why it's really important to have alignment between ERM and ESG.
So, Jana, a couple of quick questions. First of all, the workshops happened to be one of the core innovations you brought to the table, because it created a way to integrate conversation and get people talking across various disciplines. Question number one, how many people were typically in a workshop and how long did it take to do? And secondly, when you were in the workshop, how did you discriminate between something that was material and something that was anecdotal? What tool did you use to discriminate away topics that might be interesting and might be useful? They're really not on the map.
Mm-hmm. We had a group in total, as I recall, it was about 40 people that were involved in our climate risk workshops that we started out with. And then those people were broken into groups by area of expertise. So we started with a kickoff meeting with all 40. We explained the process. We told them we were going to have separate 30-minute to maybe 1 hour, depending on the number of people in a particular meeting, 30-minute to 1 hour meetings with them to specifically discuss some of these risk here, policy and legal related risk, technology risk, market risk, and so forth. And so we had a series of separate meetings. We used a tool called, I think it's Mento, which is a really cool tool that you can do for virtual presentations. And people were able to do Post-it notes and put it on a little whiteboards. There was a lot of that, what I'd call whiteboarding around potential risk. We used a voting tool to vote on which ones were most important. So it was kind of an elementary type process, but that's, pretty qualitative at this point, but that's how we did it and how we narrowed it down. We had the individual meetings, and then we brought the group back together to collectively decide, yep, this looks right.
So there was sign off at the end. Everybody generally agreed, at least for the time frame we're talking about.
That's right. That's right.
So we've got another maybe 5 minutes. So if we can sort of wrap in the next couple of minutes, and I can throw back to Jasmine for any last questions and wrap up.
No problem, because we only have just a couple of slides left. Actually, this is winding it down right now. Perfect. So basically with ESG, there's this push for measurable action for transparency in addressing ESG related risk. So you'll see companies, including ours, doing ESG reports, disclosures like TCFD, Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosure Reporting. One we didn't mention was SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and we've issued a SASB index as well. All of that is to be responsive to that push for measurable action and transparency that's being driven mostly by the investor community at this point. And so we already talked about the SEC's proposed rule for climate risk disclosure, but there's more to come. SEC is also planning to propose human capital related disclosures in 2023. And then there's additional governance disclosures that they're planning as well. I don't have as much insights onto what those could be, but we can only imagine and wait and see. The message here is be prepared. I feel like we're ignorantly fortunate because, we had this as an emerging risk. Was kind of sounding the horn through the emerging risk reporting. So we started our processes about 3 years ago, and we are very thankful today that we started 3 years ago. And this started in ERM, with our emerging risk report. So it's a great, I think, case study for the value of ERM too. Last slide, I think, is, well, a couple here. ESG is driving excellence. And then what I really like about ERM is it's never one and done. You know, it continues to evolve. I talked earlier about how first it was just the checklist to get the ERM process going. Then we started being focused on cybersecurity and business continuity, GRC. Now it's ESG. Who knows what's next, but it's never done. And then if another key piece, I kept saying, you know, make sure you partner with your ESG team. Many companies are starting to consider the role of the ESG controller. And so the ESG controller is the person that's basically responsible for all of these disclosures, such as the forthcoming SEC disclosures, the SASB index, TCFD. And because of the rigor around process and controls, SOX-like process and controls around ESG disclosure reporting, it would be a good idea to know who that person is within the company, so that from an insurance perspective, if you're working with underwriters, you're getting the reliable and validated ESG data that might be helpful in your meetings with underwriters. So with that, I'll close. So any last minute questions?
Throw it back to Jasmine.
I don't have any final questions. Just want to say thank you, Jana, for this very informative discussion. It was really interesting to hear your thoughts about how you were able to make tangible change within your organization. And I'm excited to see what's to come. And was just going to add, you were saying that it's been interesting to see how ERM has evolved as a discipline, and it will also be interesting to see how ESG evolves in the future and the integration of the two. So I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes now to grab some water, take a quick break, stretch, and then Ed Combs will be introducing the next speaker at 9:15. But again, thank you, Jana, for your time, and everyone for listening in.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jana.